Hello, good morning. Thank you all for being here with us today. I am Michelle Worley, the Executive Director of the MPN Research Foundation. Our mission is to stimulate original research in pursuit of new therapies and eventually a cure for the blood cancers polycythemia vera, essential thrombocythemia, and myelofibrosis, collectively known as the myeloproliferative neoplasms. We are so thankful for the opportunity through the externally led patient-focused drug development program to have the voice of those living with an MPN heard on the topic of drug development. 2 years ago in September, my friend and mentor Bob Rosen, one of the founders of the MPN Research Foundation, had to leave his hometown of Chicago in a hurry in order to prepare for a stem cell transplant. You see, he had been living with polycythemia vera for almost 2 decades at that point. But it had progressed to myelofibrosis, and he had exhausted all options for therapies that would allay the degradation of his bone marrow and blood system. So a transplant was his one last hope. Although Bob was 74, he was not a frail man. He had a swagger, and he made his presence known. His life before starting MPN Research Foundation included a career in real estate, being an amateur family genealogist, and in establishing with his wife Ellen a strong and amazing family. Those who knew Bob knew that he was the physical embodiment of what some of those with an MPN experience. He did not look sick. He had the quintessential invisible illness. But that changed over the course of one summer. He left Chicago in September 2017, and he died 3 months later from an infection caught after transplantation, even though his bone marrow was successfully engrafting. When that happened, we lost our organization's founder, but many lost a friend and a family member. But as anyone who speaks to people living with an MPN will tell you, it's a very heterogeneous disease. We at the foundation speak to people of all ages, sexes, and races. And today you will be hearing from people who have a very different experience from Bob and from one another, but who share a common diagnosis. We and the other advocate partners have tried to find a diverse group of people who can represent the voices of those with ET, PV, and MF so that they can speak directly to you in their own words, sharing their stories and relating to you as a person living with this disease. We can tell you absolutely that with people with an MPN, when you have seen one, you have not seen them all. I do want to mention the several people who wanted to participate who were too ill to travel. Hopefully some of them will be participating on the webinar. And one person who is not well enough but really wanted to speak on the panel was able to record a video, so you'll hear from her later today. I mentioned a few moments ago the advocates that are helping us with this meeting. We are so thrilled to have the participation of the Leukemia Lymphoma Society, MPN Advocacy and Education International, MPN Cancer Connection, and the MPN Education Foundation. We feel such comfort in having partnerships with these strong advocates and others globally, because only through working together will we have the impact for those people living with an MPN that they and you all deserve. I also want to thank our sponsors who have provided financial support for this meeting and who are also listed in the program book. They are Celgene, Constellation Pharmaceuticals, CTI Biopharma, Genentech, Insight, Cartos Therapeutics, Pharmacentia, and Sierra Oncology. I want to mention that while we had the support of industry, the meeting agenda, panelist selection, and in general organization was driven by us and the advocate partners, and in consultation with those living with an MPN, physicians, and researchers. We strive to keep the channels of communication open between all parts of the MPN community, including industry. But it was very important to us that this be an open and neutral setting for sharing of the patient voice with the FDA. And I want to acknowledge the participation of the 3 MPN physician researchers here today. Thank you to Dr. Robin Scherber, who will be providing a brief clinical overview of MPN. And thank you to Drs. Ruben Mesa and John Massarenas. These three go over and above their professional duties to support the activities of all the patient advocates here today. I don't know where they find the time. I also want to thank the FDA for allowing us this opportunity to share what we hear from patients living with PV, and MF daily. Thanks to those of you who are here today on behalf of the agency, either in person or on the webinar. It means the world to us and to those who have reached out to us to know that you are here and listening. Finally, I have to thank the staff of the MPN Research Foundation. That's Brenda, Pam, who are in the office in Chicago, and here Bill, Lindsay, Rick, Lexi, and Erica in particular, who has been dutifully outside on the registration desk and who has made all the logistics possible, so very much appreciated. So finally, today we, again, are going to hear from people with PV, and MF. But it's what happens after this meeting that I think that we're all most interested in. All of the groups present here, they advocate for patients by providing financial support for research, providing free educational resources, hosting events, hosting listservs for patients to talk privately, for hosting registries with patient-reported data. We also all publicize clinical trials and research findings to the community, both patients and physicians. But in addition to organizing this meeting so that we can facilitate the sharing of the patient experience as it pertains to drug development, we would love to gain insight into what else we can do to make our dreams come true, which is more and better therapies and eventually a cure. So I want to set that expectation in the beginning, that as we listen today, let's think about what happens tomorrow. And I want to thank the people that you're going to hear from today. Just the ones that I know of, the panelists who are going to be speaking are truly phenomenal individuals. They are strong, and they are opening themselves up to us so that we can help the rest of the community. So thank you so much for being here, and for those on video, and for those who are in the audience and in the webinar who will participate as well. Thank you. So it is now time for us to hear from Dr. Robin Scherber, MD. She's at the University of Texas, San Antonio. Robin has been a wonderful partner to the foundation. She serves on the steering committee of our MyMPN patient registry, and she was actually the one who tipped me off to the fact that this meeting even existed. So everyone, please welcome Robin.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here today. And again, I'm Robin Scherber, and I am both a physician and a researcher at UT Health San Antonio MD Anderson Cancer Center. I may not have the most gray hair in the room, but I can assure you I've been and had the wonderful privilege to, for the last 10 years, work in terms of understanding the symptom burden of MPN patients alongside Dr. Ruben Mesa. And I have to say that today is just the greatest honor to be here, but most importantly, to be here in this auspicious day where we're able to actually potentially do some good and really further not only our ability to come up with good endpoints for clinical trials, but to push the initiatives that get the clinical trials to patients who are in need and gets those therapies to where they need to go. When we look at the myeloproliferative neoplasms, this really first became a group of disorders when Dr. William Damschek in 1951 was the first one to recognize that patients with essential thrombocythemia, which is really a hallmark of too many platelets, polycythemia vera, that has a hallmark of too many red blood cells, and then myelofibrosis, where initially you can have high blood counts, but over time the bone marrow starts to scar or fibrose, that these were all related. The word in Greek, myeloproliferative, has the stem of myelo, from meaning bone marrow, to proliferate, which basically means to grow uncontrollably. So it really, in essence, describes the disease course initially, and then over time with the scarring. When we see patients, we start to think that they might have an MPN when we see higher low blood counts, especially the high blood counts for essential thrombocythemia and polycythemia vera. Over time, those blood counts can go low, especially for myelofibrosis, when the bone marrow doesn't work as efficiently as it used to in terms of producing blood. We also often will see blood clots, and these can happen all over the body. They can happen in the lungs, in the abdomen, in the veins around the liver, in the legs. We can also see an increased risk of bleeding, and for many patients, it's both an increased risk of blood clotting and bleeding, and those bleeds can happen almost anywhere. It can be gastrointestinal bleeds, you can have nose bleeds. We can see an enlarged spleen for some patients, especially in myelofibrosis, and that spleen ends up being a location where excess blood can be produced, especially when it's not being produced well in the bone marrow. And finally, symptoms that we'll talk more about today, but especially you'll hear from the patients themselves. But this constellation of different features is what we typically see with a myeloproliferative neoplasm. Putting 2019 in perspective, it really is an exciting year in general. This year marks the 14-year mark since the discovery of the JAK2 V617F mutation, the most common mutation in MPN patients. And this mutation was the key mutation that really clued us in that back in the 1950s, when William Damschek discovered that these different blood issues seem to be related, this really solidified that, where we're seeing a large portion of MPN patients have this mutation. This year marks the 8-year mark of the first FDA-approved drug for myelofibrosis, which is ruxolitinib, or Jakafi. It's the 6-year mark from the calreticulin mutation discovery. And again, this was a large work where they were able to find this mutation in multiple labs, and it's the second most common mutation for MPN patients. This is the 5-year mark for the FDA approval in polycythemia vera of Jakafi or ruxolitinib, and it's the 2-year mark from when we have our first National Comprehensive Cancer Network, or NCCN, guidelines for clinicians to help guide their care. Before that, it was really kind of what you had learned from your previous mentors as a clinician, and so having these guidelines means a lot to how we treat. But this year alone has been extremely important for MPN patients, where we're able to have a second FDA-approved drug in myelofibrosis, which is fedratinib. We have new and updated prognostic scoring tools. Now more than ever, we have a good idea in what we should be able to expect from patients. We have ones that help incorporate in molecular changes. We also have a slew of new and exciting drugs, but this really puts it in perspective that this year, more than ever, we need to figure out how we can get these drugs to do the maximum benefit for which patients. And before we can do that, we really need to understand where the needs lie in terms of symptoms and disease outcomes and the disease course in general. MPNs are not a very common disease. Overall, it looks to be around 300,000 patients in the US that have an MPN, with a prevalence anywhere between from the 30s up to the 50s per 100,000 people for both polycythemia vera and essential thrombocythemia. And for myelofibrosis, it's much more rare. Anywhere between 4 to 5 per 100,000 people will have MF. What's interesting, though, is that we know the prevalence of MPN seems to be going up. In one analysis, they looked at patients in between 2000, so basically up to 2006 that they could find, and then from 2006 to 2012, and they saw around a 2 to 3-fold increase. Now, is this the true prevalence, or is this just our ability to be able to genetically detect the disease earlier? That is not fully answered, but I would argue the latter. I think it's our rapid availability of genetic testing and having found those genetic mutations that allows us for potentially earlier identification of the disease. In terms of how MPNs develop, we know that these mutations happen at the level of the hematopoietic stem cell, the early cells that can produce other blood cell types. And they happen particularly within this JAK-STAT signaling pathway that goes to produce blood, as well as is important for inflammatory pathways. Once they pick up these mutations, this really can cause the disease manifestation. Again, too many platelets, too many red blood cells, or over time, that scarring of the bone marrow that's now been worn out, potentially from years of producing blood. Although for some patients, they just wind up with myelofibrosis. That was a primary issue, that we don't really see a history of elevated blood counts before that. ultimately almost like rolling a dice. The more often you roll a dice, the more often you are to hit a certain number. And as those cells grow faster and faster, we see them often pick up other mutations that could potentially lead to disease transformation, either from PVET to MF or potentially into acute leukemia. In talking about the different manifestations or what it feels like to be an MPN patient, a lot of our work has looked at this and the different symptoms that patients can have, but we know in general that these symptoms arise from the disease features themselves. One of the major causes of symptoms is either high or low blood counts. When blood counts go high, this can lead to vascular issues and can often lead to symptoms such as itching, fatigue, and symptoms related to blood clots. So you can get pain with blood clots. Vascular events in general can also be related to bleeding, and especially when blood counts might go low, we might be predisposed to bleeding. In some cases, even when blood counts go very high. In general, disease progression can potentially lead to increasing symptoms. Organ dysfunction, so especially when patients have things like a large spleen that, again, might be producing blood cells when the bone marrow is not working as well, that can push onto the abdomen and cause abdominal discomfort, pain, bloating. We can see it push onto the abdomen, onto the stomach, and cause basically getting full fast or early satiety. Inflammation itself, which is again related to that JAK-STAT signaling pathway, can cause symptoms directly, things like constitutional symptoms, so fatigue, night sweats, fevers. We can also see that inflammation go and cause other issues like anemia of chronic disease, where the blood is just not being produced as well due to inflammation alone. And then we have to put this in perspective of a person. The average age of diagnosis of an MPN is in the 60s. But, as you'll hear today, some people are diagnosed very early in life. But in general, this is someone who may already have some baseline health issues, some things that already might be impacted by medications they're on. And then we have our medications alone for MPNs that might impact blood counts, that might cause people to be more anemic, but with the idea that we want to make them feel better. So when we see these symptoms, we have to look at the whole person, but in general, many of the symptoms that patients with MPNs experience are due to the disease themselves. Looking specifically at essential thrombocythemia, we know that in general in MPNs, the survival of MPN patients is lower than that of age-matched peers. And we see that there is this risk, again, of transformation. For essential thrombocythemia, it's anywhere between 1 to 5% at 10 years. But really, our paradigm in terms of treatment, at least the traditional paradigm, was really to try to combat what are the most frequent or worrisome issues that can happen with the disease. Specifically in the graph to the right, you can see that issues that can arise over time, especially by 10 years in patients with essential thrombocythemia, some of our major risk is for blood clotting and the risk of cerebrovascular events like strokes or cardiovascular events like heart attacks. We do also see transformation to other blood cancers, as well as other disorders and even solid tumors like skin cancers that can develop. For polycythemia vera, again, we have a high incidence of disease transformation at 10 years, anywhere between 5% to 6%. It's a little higher than essential thrombocythemia. We also know that the overall survival is diminished compared to age-matched controls. Most often, if we do see progression, it's from polycythemia vera to myelofibrosis or transformation. We can see some transformation from polycythemia vera into acute leukemia indirectly. And again, in this instance, our major issues and the reasons why we usually will start pharmacologic therapy is to try to reduce risk of blood clots for either cerebrovascular events or cardiovascular events. We can see, again, transformation in terms of hematologic malignancy as well as development of solid tumors. And we start to see infections being an issue as well. For myelofibrosis, the survival is lower than essential thrombocythemia or polycythemia vera. We know that the leukemic transformation rate is anywhere between 10 to 20% in the first 10 years of the disease. Again, issues with this starts to be more of disease transformation into other types of heme malignancies, although infections also start to be issues, and we can get other types of solid tumors that develop and other disorders that may or may not be related to MPNs that end up taking people's lives. The good news in myelofibrosis is that our survival seems to be getting better than ever. So in a few analyses, prior to 1995, the average survival for a patient with myelofibrosis was around 5 years. But later, this was around the area of JAK inhibitors, analysis showed that it had increased to almost 7 years. And now in the era of JAK inhibitors, potentially we have even longer survival. In terms of how we treat, it really varies between the type of MPN. In essential thrombocythemia and polycythemia vera, our main goal in terms of clinicians is to try to reduce the risk of thrombosis. In some instances, we try to reduce the blood cell count or stimulate, less common, to try to help normalize blood counts. We also do try to reduce disease-related symptoms, but this has been less of a therapeutic strategy until recently, where we've been trying to do this more and more. In myelofibrosis, our main goals initially are try to reduce the spleen size for people with a large spleen and improve symptom burden. Usually in this disease state, we try to stimulate blood production because blood counts can tend to go lower, especially when the disease has been happening for longer. And we try to reduce the risk of bleeding, particularly. Some of the therapies that we use for MPN patients can be anything from transfusions when blood counts are low to ways to try to take out blood counts, so things like pheresis, where we spin down the blood and are able to take out potentially types of cells we don't want, to phlebotomy, where we just basically do a large blood draw. Surgery and radiation can be used in some cases, although we use this less frequently. In terms of actual pharmacologic therapies, we have aspirin, especially for essential thrombus, for ET and PV, and this can really help reduce the risk of blood clotting. We have different types of what would be considered a chemotherapy, like hydroxyurea. There's biologic therapies, things like interferon or erythropoietin analogs that can help your body to actually stimulate the production of its own red cells. We have now the targeted therapies, things like JAK inhibitors, so there's ruxolitinib or Jakafi and fedratinib. And now more than ever, we have clinical trials of new and exciting drug therapies. I do want to bring up the issue that you will hear from many of the patients today of progression. And progression can mean many different things in MPNs. It doesn't necessarily mean disease transformation. For some patients, it means the features of the disease becoming more severe. Potentially that hydroxyurea that used to work pretty well for them is no longer working. It could mean changing the type of MPN. I think now more than ever we're thinking that essential thrombocythemia and polycythemia vera don't usually change between each other, but there are some patients who have experienced that, and they were told they have an ET, and then later on they were told they have polycythemia vera. Both of those could potentially progress to myelofibrosis over time as the years of blood production start to scar the marrow, and then changing into acute leukemia. And when it becomes that point, we do our best with things like stem cell transplant, which is our only potential cure for MPN patients. But unfortunately, it's a hard thing to undergo. It takes a lot of time, and there is not always the best outcomes once someone's progressed to acute leukemia. I'd like to open this up to Mr. Valentine, who's going to bring us into the next part of today's talk, and thank you all.